Okay, welcome to the second part of the social learning theory. You should at this point have notes and understanding of what the social learning theory is, how it's different from the behavioural approach, and now we're going to look at the positives and negatives of it as an approach. Okay, at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to apply it, evaluate, and start to be able to compare and contrast it to other factors. Okay, all AO3. Okay, so the first is, a lot of this is just comparing to another theory, and in this first point it's the importance of cognitive factors. Both classical and operant conditioning, when you think about them, are just really basic. You learn by association, or you learn by being electrocuted or punished or whatever. And if you go straight to that Bandura quote, he's basically talking about classical and operant conditioning and saying that this is why we need to make it a bit more complex, because if we just learned by classical and operant, learning would be exceedingly laborious, means takes a lot of time, not to mention hazardous. What you're saying there is, what we wait until we get hit by a car in the road before we learn not to, run across busy roads. That's obviously not the case. If people had to solely rely on the effects of their own actions to inform them what to do, from observing others, one forms an idea of how new behaviours are performed. On later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. So, I mean, that car one is obvious. We're not going to. We learn how to cross roads not by getting hit by cars. We learn because we watch other people. Maybe we did see somebody get hit. We saw vicarious learning, and we've learned from that. So, social learning theory is positive in regards to classical and operant, is a more comprehensive explanation of human learning. So it can explain a lot more than just the classical and operant. So that's the first positive point. This is a negative, so it's saying that because the social learning theory, behavioural theory are both quite lab-based, they try and manipulate behaviour and show it happening. They can get an over-reliance from evidence from labs, so hopefully at this point you understand the kind of terms like maybe ecological validity, demand characteristics. So many of Bandura's ideas were developed through observation of young children in labs in the Bobo doll experiment. Labs are often criticised for having demand characteristics. If we put you in a lab situation, we say we're going to be doing an experiment, you're automatically thinking you need to behave in a certain way, and you might therefore show demand characteristics, which is basically changing the way you behave. It's because there's an experiment, because you're trying to either fit in with the experiment or go the opposite way. With the Bobo doll particularly, a Bobo doll in itself it wants to be hit. Challenge any of you to walk past a big bouncy thing that bounces back up at you and you don't give it a little dig. It wasn't massively like real life. They saw their parents or adults hitting it and they just thought, oh, that's the way I've got to behave. They hadn't necessarily learned that that's it. There was no evidence to show that outside the lab these kids became more aggressive. Therefore, social learning theory may tell us little about how children actually learn aggression in real life. So when something's a lab, it's not real life, it lacks ecological validity, and that can be a big one. And as you go through with the Bobo doll, you'll learn a lot more about the negatives of that as a lab experiment. This is the idea that it's reductionist. You may have heard that term. It underestimates, the influence of biological factors. So it's just saying this is how boys and girls learn, and he doesn't talk about biological factors. And one of the things you'll learn in psychology about, or in life in general, is that it's never really one extreme or the other. It's always going to be somewhere in the middle, and psychology is a lot like that. The biological psychologists can't fully explain all behaviours without using a little bit of behavioural and a little bit of learning, and vice versa. So this is saying that Bandura and the social learning theory should really make reference to biological factors, and they don't. And the point around that is the fact that boys are always more aggressive than girls in the situation. And so it can't just be the situation, because the situation is exactly the same for the boy and the girl. So why are boys more aggressive? And then we've got maybe that idea that hopefully you've heard of testosterone, and that is more in boys than girls, and testosterone is heavily linked to aggression. Testosterone is a biological explanation of aggression. So social learning theory can't explain the difference between boys and girls in its labs. So it is underestimating the influence of biological factors. Hopefully that makes sense. However, it does explain cultural differences. So a big positive from it is it's able to explain cultural differences in learning behaviour. Social learning theory can account for how children learn from others and through the media. This has proved useful in understanding a range of behaviours, such as how children become understand their gender. And if you're not an A2 student yet, then you look at that a lot, and aggression in A2 about it shows how one culture in aggression, so, somewhere in Africa or South America, where there's no aggression whatsoever in the tribes, in the people, and no one shows aggression because they haven't learnt it. Whereas in aggressive Western cultures, usually we've got aggression on the TV all the time. We've got it on the news. We've got it in films. So we're able to learn through aggression through watching it. Big boxing fights, things like that, and that shows how there's cultural differences. Shows how we can go from one culture to another and be surprised, and it doesn't have to be aggression or anything like that. If you personally have ever been to a country where you've had a culture shock, then social learning theory would explain that. Somewhere where things are so different, and you hear of in Japan, just no one chews gum. There's no chewing gum anymore. I've been to some countries where you just feel how different it is, and their social learning theories would explain that, whereas biological wouldn't explain that, because biological would say that everyone has testosterone, therefore everyone must have the same level of aggression. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, this idea of determinism and free will you might understand fully right now, or you might still just be getting the understanding of it, the basic understanding. It is less deterministic than the behavioural approach, so it is saying that we have some free will about us. If something is completely deterministic, it is saying, if I electrocute you 10 times, you will no longer do it no matter what. If I reward you 5 times, you will no longer do you'll carry on doing that behaviour no matter what. That's very deterministic. Free will is saying that you can always make your own decisions, and at every point we can make our own decision. So this is saying it's less deterministic than the behavioural approach. It still is deterministic, but it does allow for some parts of free will. Okay, next lesson, cognitive.